Okay, good morning, everybody. Can I welcome everybody to our meeting of the Nottinghamshire Pension Fund Committee. There's no members in the public gallery, so I won't read the normal long stuff. My name is Eric Kerry, Councillor Eric Kerry. I'm the chairman of the committee. Now, I remind members that this meeting is being broadcast live, and can I ask you to use your microphones when speaking and switch them off when you finish, please, and just remind you that please turn off any of your mobile phones, etc., that might go off in the meeting. Thank you very much. So the first item on the agenda is the minutes of the last meeting, which we held a month ago-ish, whatever it was, on the 13th of June. Can I ask the committee if the minutes can be agreed, please? Is that okay with everybody? Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, we'd like to second them, Councillor Saddington. We can't hear you without the microphone on.
Not my voice.
Thank you. Can I move on to item number 2 is apologies for absence. Please may I ask Joe Toomey to confirm any apologies and substitutions.
Thank you. Today we have an apology from Councillor Jackson, who's being substituted by Councillor Owen, and apology from Councillor Place, who's being substituted by Councillor Creamer. We've also had apologies from Yvonne Davidson, the Trade Union Rep, and Councillor AJ Matsiko from Nottingham City Council. We've also heard from Everton Lewis Gordon that he is attending today. He's just running late, so his apologies about that.
Okay, thank you very much, Joe. Whilst I'm on this one, on membership, etc., I'd like to welcome back Chris King, a former trade union representative of here who retired recently and is now representing our pensioner members. So we welcome Chris's vast experience and of our fund. Welcome back, sir. Thank you. Okay, do we have any item number 3, declaration of interest by any members and officers, please? Okay, I see none, so we're moving swiftly on to item number 4 is the abolition of lifetime allowances. So before I hand over to Sarah Stevenson and Gavin Paul, who is a senior pensions consultant from Barnet Waddingham, to introduce the report, I'd like to move the recommendation, which is on page 9 of the agenda pack. Can I have a seconder, please?
I'll second that, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Sue. So please, may I hand over to yourself, Sarah?
Thank you, Councillor Kerry. Pensions Committee members will no doubt remember that Councillor Waters raised a question in a previous meeting regarding the government at that time's decision to abolish the lifetime allowance, and it was agreed that we would invite Barnet Waddingham, the fund's actuary, to this meeting to deliver a presentation regarding that particular change. The slides are contained within the papers that have been circulated. Just to reassure you, Gavin isn't going to go through every single slide. They are there for more detail for yourselves, but clearly he will cover the main points, and obviously you have an opportunity to ask questions. So I'm now going to invite Gavin Paul. As Eric has said, he is a senior pensions consultant from Barnet Waddingham to deliver the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you all. Good morning, everybody. I thought just a bit of background about me. So although I'm from the scheme actuary, my background isn't actuarial. I used to be a pensions lawyer with Evershed Sutherland, and prior to that, Pinsent Mason. So I'm on the governance side of things. So this is a lot of reading. This is the sort of thing I like to do, really, but not on the mathematical side of things. As Sarah said, if you want to ask questions, I'm happy to take them either during or at the end of the session. Hopefully the session will last 20 to 25 minutes. There are a lot of slides here. I'm due to give a presentation to the officers later, so that's why they're quite detailed. But what I do for your purposes is go through the key parts of it at a high level, and hopefully get a good understanding about this area, because it's an area which probably won't affect many people, because you're talking about people that have $1 million or more in their pension pot. But it is important because for the consequences for those that do have such pension pots of that amount, there are lots of tax issues and things like that. So there will be issues for the fund, no doubt, with certain members. So next slide, please, Sarah. So this is the agenda. I'm not planning to go through it all because we won't have enough time. Well, it extends the meeting by about another hour, I think, if there was to. But so I won't do that. And we'll focus on the 4 key areas. Next slide, please, Sarah. And I thought I would start with a little potted history. How do we get here? To start with, I started in pensions, believe it or not, in 1987. I used to work for the Prudential back then, and there was a tax regime in there. It was all to do with exempt approved schemes, and everything was set out in practice notes. This big, thick document you'd refer to would set out the parameters of benefits that could be provided under a scheme at that time, and it was set up. It was largely focused on the outcome, which is what I mean by that is the pension. And generally, a member couldn't receive more than 2/3 of their final salary as a pension when they came to retire. So that's broadly it. But it was a lot more complicated than that. As members joined at different times, tax regime started, the government changed tax regimes. So it was complicated. There's all sorts of different routes for different members. So on the 6th of April 2005, it was due to come in, was this thing called tax simplification. And we all looked around and we thought, yeah, this is going to be easy from now on. It was called A-Day. Going back, I'll try to find why it was called A-Day. I know it's going back 18 years, but I think it was just called that because this is a new beginning, that's all. The idea would be tax simplification, but in actual fact, it wasn't. It wasn't for many reasons, partly because of the previous regime. You can't wipe everything out when you bring a new regime in. So it was complicated. It came in on 6th of April 2006. It was actually a year later than planned because I think of the complications. I remember I was a pension scholar at the time, and I think we're all relieved it was delayed by a year, but it was simply because of all the difficulties with it. But now tax simplification, it changed it from the outcome, the benefit, to the value of that benefit. So it was based on 2 key allowances. One was the first one, and the main one was the lifetime allowance. And what that was the amount of money, the amount in an individual's pot, the maximum amount an individual could have in their pot to provide their benefits. If they had a pot of money that was higher than that, then they would suffer tax charges. Now, at the time when they came in, it was 1.5 million. So you had to have a pot of more than 1.5 million before you were affected by this, effectively, which isn't going to affect many people. But over time, that changed. So it was based on the fund value at the end when you come to retirement. So that seemed to me at the time very much straightforward than the previous regime. Secondly, it's the annual allowance. So alongside that, so the lifetime allowance looks at what's the value of benefits at the end. The annual allowance is sort of year by year. So there was a limit on which members could increase their benefits throughout a year. So now that is still in force. We'll talk about the abolition of the lifetime allowance in a moment. The annual allowance is still running, and that's currently £60,000. Just to give you an idea how that works. If, for example, you're in it's easier to explain in a defined contribution scheme rather than a defined benefit scheme. But if I was to put in a contribution of £65,000, heaven forbid, into my pension scheme, that would reach the annual allowance. And the annual allowance is tied in with the tax relief an individual can have, and you're penalised if you put more in than that. In a way that effectively eliminates any tax relief you get on the excess amount. So the annual allowance is still there, and obviously that's there because we know the government's tax relief. I did read this the other day. The tax relief, I think, is worth something like £50 billion, the cost of it to the government. So this is, of course, an area they are looking at. It's not a cost that they're paying out, but it's a cost. I guess it's revenue they could be getting in or they're missing out on. So annual allowance is one of those ways to stop individuals piling money, cash into schemes that way. And it was based on, and the payments, the way it was based under legislation is that it's all to do with, when you pay a benefit out, it needs to be an authorised payment. And anything that's not described as an authorised payment within the regulations is deemed to be an unauthorised payment, and that attracts tax charges. So that was the basis. You had allowances and you had authorised and unauthorised payments. On the face of it, it seemed pretty straightforward, but unfortunately, it became far from simple. Next slide, please, Sarah. So I just thought I'd summarise here. So if we start with, in summary, the lifetime allowance and annual allowance, we just had those, it'd be quite straightforward. Now moving to the left, the one thing I will point out now, because it will become important as we go through this session, is that you remember that with a pension, you also get a tax-free cash sum. And that's, I think, the bit that the government is always worried about, because it's tax-free. And for years, actually, they've been talking, there's always been whispers before any budget that they will remove it or do something to limit the tax-free lump sum. That hasn't happened, although arguably it may have done. As we go through this session, you'll see why. But that was limited to 25% of, for most people, their pension pot. So if I had a pension pot that was worth £400,000, the maximum tax-free cash sum I could have from the scheme would be £100,000, a quarter of that, the value of that fund. If you happen to be up at the lifetime allowance, it would be a quarter of the lifetime allowance. That's where it tops out. You can't have any more than that as a tax-free cash sum. So remember, that's the tax-free cash sum element. So why did it become complicated? Well, looking down the right-hand side, at the time that the lifetime allowance was brought in, the annual allowance brought in 2006, there would have been individuals out there who would already have pots that were worth more than, at the time, 1.5 million. So there was protection in there to ensure that those people weren't penalised. Say, for example, they had 2 million, they don't want to be suddenly hit with a tax charge because the legislation has changed all of a sudden. So there were various protections brought in, so that complicated matters because those just exist. They continue in existence. And also, secondly, you had individuals that had benefits that would provide more than 25% tax-free cash sum. And also, at the same time this was introduced, they also increased the age at which people could draw their benefits initially from 50 to 55, just to recognise that people are living longer. And again, it's to sort of just limit some of those benefits people are getting from schemes. So under some schemes, though, people had a right to retire before then. So depending on what your rules said, and again, it's very complicated, this legislation, certain benefits were protected. So these protections, we call them transitional protections, make things complicated. They're still there now. Next slide, please. I just thought, I don't really want to talk too much about this, but this is, over time, I thought I'd give you an idea of how the lifetime allowance and the annual allowance changed. So it was all very generous to begin with, got up to 1.8 million in 2010, but things started to change. I guess that was at the time, the new government wasn't there around that time, the financial crisis. They were looking at ways just to rein back in terms of tax relief. So the lifetime allowance has changed over time. As you can see, it's gradually gone down and down. And what that does, every time it decreased, don't forget you'll have individuals who the year before would have been thinking, the lifetime allowance is 1.8 million. So they built up a pot of money up to that, thinking they're okay with that. And suddenly the next year it's reduced to 1.5 million. They're in that same position that the people were in at the time it was introduced back in 2006. You have pots above the lifetime allowance. So every time there was a change there, a reduction, more protection was brought in to protect those members so that they don't suffer a tax charge. So this is where it started to become complicated. And the annual allowance down the right-hand side, again, you can see how that's reduced over time. And just broadly, higher earning individuals also have their allowance tapers depending on how much their salary is. So it's yes, it's relatively complicated. Next slide, please. So moving on to the real purpose I'm here, there was a surprising announcement made in March 2020. I was certainly taken aback by it. I'm reading about it yesterday. I think some people are claiming they weren't surprised, but when Jeremy Hunt in March 2023 in his budget suddenly announced, I was watching it live, I'm sorry to say, but I was, he said, we're abolishing the lifetime allowance. And it was one of those times when I thought, did I hear that right? But it was a big change. Probably prompted, if you remember, there was a lot of issues around consultants in the NHS who'd already built up their maximum and they're desperately needed by the NHS. So I think that was a lot of the background noise around that. But yes, it was abolished in 2023. And finally, it came into effect. It was finally abolished by legislation on the 6th of April 2024. Now, the Labour Party at the time said, so when it was first announced, said, we don't like that, we will reintroduce it if we get into power. That changed over time. As in the run up to the election, you might have heard, but I don't blame you if you didn't, is that the Labour Party said that we will not be reintroducing it. So as things currently stand, the lifetime allowance will remain abolished. But who knows? Who knows? I think the Labour Party has a lot of work to do, and who knows what will happen once they've assessed the balance sheet of the UK and that. So, but at the moment, it's staying as it is. It is abolished. Next slide, please, Sam. So, just at an outset, what are the changes? And we'll go through some of these in a little bit more detail shortly. And I'll just read through these. So, the lifetime allowance is fully abolished. So, there is no specific limit on the pension savings an individual can make up can build up in their lifetime. So that means that instead of worrying about a million cap on the fund you can build up, you can go to whatever you want now. But it would be easy if we stopped there. But because of the tax-free element of this, 2 standard lump sum allowances were introduced. So what this means is, say if you built up a pot of 10 million, you can't take a £2.5 million lump sum as 25% of that fund. This will limit you. So 2 lump sum allowances were introduced, a lump sum allowance and a lump sum and death benefit allowance, and they restrict the amount of tax-free cash you can have. And I'll talk a little bit more detail shortly. The penalties for paying out a lump sum above the lifetime allowance when it was in existence were quite penal. It's 55% if that excess was taken as a lump sum. It's not quite so high as if you take that excess as a pension. So it's quite penal, but now it's charged the member's marginal rate. So that's lower than it was. The protections can be increased, or these allowances can be increased if you have that lifetime protection I was talking about, which still exists. They still lurk in the background. Again, they allow people to take a higher lump sum. Next slide, please, Sam. I won't talk about the overseas transfer allowance. That's all to do with making the transfer of benefits to an overseas scheme, but that's another allowance that's brought in. Now, relevant benefit crystallisation events, you'll see lots of acronyms in this. It's simply because the slides would be enormous if I had to use the full phrases, but they replace benefit crystallisation events, and I will talk about that. A crystallisation event is a time when you draw a benefit. It triggers an assessment at that point. We'll talk about that a bit later. And don't forget, members now often have different pension pots. There are pension pots here, there, and everywhere, and they may be taking benefits at different times. So there are transitional arrangements, again, it complicates it, which take account of benefits that are paid before the 6th of April 2024. And I'll talk about what you can do, how they're accounted for, how an administrative authority will account for those before they pay a member's benefit out shortly. Next page, sir. Next one. So the new allowances. So just briefly, relevant benefits crystallisation event. Just to recap again, so there's no lifetime allowance test now. Don't have to worry about that. But these tests, it's an assessment point. So it's when an individual takes their benefit. You assess their allowances at that point. Lump sums, as I said, are now tested against those 2 new allowances. And then every time you take a tax-free cash sum, say if you've got different pension pots here, there, and everywhere, it reduces the amount you can take from the next one. So gradually, your pot starts at. I won't give the amount away in a minute, but that amount you start with reduces over time, so you can't have more than that amount. So if you start with, if you have a pension of a lump sum of 100,000 for the first scheme, you would only have 168,000 afterwards. The reason I say 168,000 is because next page, Sarah, is the lump sum allowance is set at 200. Very easy, a number that rolls off the tongue: £268,275. So that's the maximum amount an individual can take. Now, what is interesting about, well, I find it interesting, is that there's no provision for that to increase. So to me, it's a little bit like, the higher tax rate that band hasn't increased, so it's catching more and more people. In the same way, this will proportionately reduce the amount of lump sum that people can take, particularly the high earners who have big pension pots. They still cannot take any more than the £265,275, unless they have some of these protections I've been talking about. So it's worth remember that is the maximum amount you can receive. Because it's worth noting that most LGPS members are not going to be anywhere near this amount. So for most people, in fact, most people in the UK, this won't really bite, but for those who it does, could have significant consequences. And it's only when certain payments are made that this is reduced. So it's knocked down every time a member takes either a pension commencement lump sum, so that's your normal tax-free cash sum. Pension commencement lump sum because it's supposed to come in payment at the time your pension comes into payment. They're linked together. An uncrystallised funds pension lump sum, that's something that's payable from a defined contribution scheme. You might remember pension freedoms. That's what that really ties in with. And you also have these things called standalone lump sums, where tax-free cash sum schemes pay out cash sums which aren't necessarily linked to a pension. So every time those are taken, your lump sum allowance get deducted from the lump sum allowance. So over time, that could, if it gets down to zero, there's no more allowance for a lump sum. You wouldn't be able to take a tax-free cash sum. And if I mentioned before, if you do happen to make that payment or receive a payment above that amount, it is taxed at the marginal rate. So it's not a penal 55% as it was. Next slide, please, Sarah. The lump sum and death benefit allowance is the other one. It's very similar, but what this also includes, it includes the three elements I talked about earlier, but it also includes those payments that are made in the event of serious ill health, and that's when an individual receives all of his benefits as a lump sum because they've only got a year or so left to live. That's when that's paid out. But also if there's a lump sum benefit payable from the scheme. So this is relevant. A lot of this will be relevant to the beneficiaries. So you will need to make that test then. So it's not necessarily they'll be triggered, or almost certainly, I'd imagine, because of the lump sum benefit. That tends to be the bigger sum, and it will need to be assessed by the beneficiaries because even they may need to pay tax if a lump sum is paid that's above the lump sum and death benefit allowance. And that's set, I forgot to mention at the very start, that's set at what was the last lifetime allowance amount, which was 1 million. Again, rolls at the top, £1,072,100. And again, there's no mechanism at the moment for that to increase. So that's a big difference. At least under the old regime, it was increasing over time. Next slide, please, Sam. So what about the application of these? Well, this is sort of important from the administering authority's point of view. So they will need to make a check before payment is made out. So the allowance could be affected, sort of touched on these briefly already, if a member has crystallised any pension benefits previously. So that means they've taken some benefits from another scheme or potentially from that same scheme. If the member holds a valid protection, which is that, if you add down lifetime allowance protection, that increases the amount of lump sum because, remember, those people would have had that protection because their fund level already exceeded the lifetime allowance at that time. Enhancement factors, they're very specific to do with pension sharing and overseas allowances. I won't go into that in any more detail. Any other lump sums that are paid out from the 6th of April 2024, they'll be deducted. And also there are lots of transitional rules for those benefits that were paid under the old regime, which we'll talk about shortly. Next slide, please, Sal.
Can I just ask a question, Gary, on that one? The bullet point. If a member's crystallised any pension benefits previously, I mean, some people have complex pensions with different AVCs, different historical pension funds, haven't transferred, all that kind of stuff. So, does every pensioner that goes through this process, or do they always send in the right information so that people can be properly assessed?
you and I'll talk from the fund perspective
Yeah,
what we do.
yeah, sure. So it's probably not well, particularly going forward. It is they are required to provide information. It's a very interesting point because you are relying on that individual.
Within our within our retirement pack, there is a section where members are required to declare whether they've had any other crystallisation events. Obviously, some of our members may have an in-house AVC with Scottish Widows or the Crew, so we would be aware of that. But as Gavin said, they have to self-declare if they've had other events, but I guess ultimately HMRC are likely to catch up with them if they haven't declared that.
Yeah, and we'll talk about a bit more. There's a certificate that comes with this, and we'll talk about that in a short while. Just move on to briefly LTA protections, which again are these protections that exist because of change. The introduction of lifetime allowance to begin with in 2006, and the reductions over time. But those, remember, they can only have 25% of the value. Still, the same principle applies, but their value will be higher because what these do, they protect a higher level of lifetime allowance for them. But it's worth remembering because that does come into play. As Sarah will find out as administrator, you need to be aware of these. But there's a reliance on the member to do the right thing and to provide the details to you. Next slide, please. So, talking about transitional protections, transitional certificates. So, where a member has drawn a benefit, I mean, hopefully this won't affect too many people, but of course, people do have pension pots here, there, and everywhere now because people don't tend to stay in the same employment anymore. And also, in my experience, your provider changes over time. So you might be with Standard Life, I don't know, for one, okay, and then suddenly you're with someone else. So you do tend to find there are pots of pension pots here, there, and everywhere. Not such an issue for the LGPS, of course, but you need to take into account the benefits taken between April 2006 and up to April 2024. So this is where a member has drawn their benefits, and you're working out how much should be deducted from their tax-free, their lump sum allowance, their tax-free amount. So there's two ways of doing it. One is what we call a standard approach. You assume that they've taken the full 25% lump sum from those benefits that they've already drawn. But of course, that might not always be the case for some people. Some people might have not wanted a lump sum at that time, or they may have felt only wanted a small proportion of that. So unless you do something, the pension fund that's paying the benefits will assume that you've drawn the full 25%. However, a member can apply for what's known as a transitional tax-free amount certificate, and that sets out, or what should set out, where you have received less than 25% from a previous benefit, that should set out exactly what you did receive. And if it's lower than 25%, of course, that will allow your tax-free allowance, your lump sum allowance, won't be reduced as much because it will be less than 25%, which is lower than the assumed amount of 25%. Now, those certificates are almost set in stone. So once you've done that, you've got to you hand it over to the fund, and the fund has to use that as its basis for calculating its benefits. The only time it can be withdrawn is if there's an error. I'd imagine, I'm not quite sure whether fraud, for example, may be another reason for it. Coming back to if a member said, actually, I received this when they never did, to try and increase their lump sum allowance. But it's the interesting thing there is it's an individual decision. The individual makes that decision. Is this the right thing to do to go for a certificate because I think it's going to increase my lump sum allowance? But what happens if they have a surprise with that certificate, or the information provided isn't quite as they thought it was going to be? So, but that's an individual decision. But said once it's in place, certificate, it's almost set in stone. And again, remember, this is for people that are probably high earners anyway, so it won't affect too many people. Next slide, please, Sarah. And I've already spoken about that slide, so we can move on. So just briefly, the types of lump sum we receive from a scheme. One is the usual one, which is the pension commencement lump sum, the sort of the classic tax-free cash sum. And the key thing about that is that's obviously tested against the member's lifetime, sorry, the lump sum allowance and the lump sum death benefit allowance. And it can only be paid if it has any of those allowances available. And it's the lowest of the 25% of the capital value the member is crystallising. That's the point I sort of emphasised before. And they're available LSA and they're available LSDVA. It's the lower of those ones that's available. And it can only be paid in connection with a relevant pension. That's why it's called a pension commencement lump sum. It has to be paid at the same time a pension is paid. Next slide, please. And again, I apologise for these acronyms rather, but this is one where it's this is the defined benefit lump sum payable from the scheme in the event of a member's death. So that's again tested against the LSDVA. That one is. Okay, but not against the LSA. Next slide, please. And finally, as a pension commencement excess lump sum, some schemes used to allow a benefit to be paid out which was higher than the maximum tax-free cash. But it would mean you'd have to pay a tax charge on that. The regulations do allow this, but at the moment the LGPS is not permitting this, but it's something that the LGA is looking at as to whether it should be permitted or not. At the moment, the LGPS wouldn't have allowed what was there previously, the previous type of excess lump sum, but understand that the government department is anticipating that LGPS should be able to, but I don't think it's clarified yet. We're still waiting for some guidance from the LGA on this. Next slide. I'm just coming to an end now. This is more to do with the procedural points now. I won't go into the overseas transfer allowance. That's another allowance, and that's to do with when you're transferring benefits outside of the UK. Next slide, please. The administering authority does have some responsibilities. I'm going to talk about this more with the officers later. So when a relevant benefit crystallisation event occurs, they must provide the member with a statement, even if the member payment is a fully taxable lump sum using no allowances. The statement must contain the monetary value of the used up allowances, and they should receive this as an annual statement following it. And then if members have received a benefit crystallisation event statement, which is the one that goes back to the old regime, and have owned crystallised rights in the scheme on the 5th of April 2024, so they still have benefits within the scheme, they must receive a benefit crystallisation statement before the 6th of April 2025. So again, that would be something that the fund will need to issue to members. But the other thing, the RBCE is an ongoing requirement, an annual statement. And finally, I didn't really want to go through this. This is the how tax is paid through and how it's reported to the HMRC. So this is something really for the officers. So moving on to the next slide, please. And just to finish off, really, a couple of things is you'll be aware of McLeod, the fact that may be increasing. I think we're finding that it's probably not increasing as many people's benefits as we thought it might do. But if there is an increase, unlike other public service schemes, which are sort of looking back, they're checking benefits as they were paid, accrued, when as if the McLeod remedy was in place all those years historically. But this, with the LGPS, you look at the time the benefits are actually paid out, so that'll be at the point it's paid out in the future. So that it will just be all accounted for within a relevant benefit crystallisation event. There's no looking back for the LGPS. And finally, the next steps I've just included, again, something for the officers to discuss with them. Is there'll be a checklist, because one of the things we need to do is sort of to start to make members aware of this, the changes, because some people, just don't pick up on it. So I think it's important for the fund to communicate with members so they're aware of these changes and what things they can do, particularly, for example, where somebody was restricted by the old regime, but now isn't. So there will be some communication with members to be made, and that's what this slide covers. And I'll talk about that with the officers later in the day. And that's all I wanted to talk about. Happy to take any questions. It's quite a dry area, quite complex, but happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's not really a question, it's more of a comment. So first off, thank you for doing that piece of work, which I had requested at a previous meeting. It is a really complex area. As part of my day job, I deal with repatriating overseas pensions and cure-ups back to the UK into SIPs or wherever. So there's a lot of loopholes in that area which haven't been tidied up yet.
Yeah.
And it's just really, interesting is the wrong word, but HMRC, it still seems like they haven't tidied up a lot of the legislation in their minds, and a lot of the providers, especially in the DC world, have interpreted the legislation slightly different ways, and a lot of clients we have aren't aware of the transitional reliefs and what they can apply for and what it does. So I think there's a lot of complication in the DB world of things where people just really don't know at all how it impacts them. So when the communication does go out to members, it would be handy, because there might be a handful of people who are impacted by this. So thank you for doing what you've done there.
Well, interesting. I'm sorry I didn't go more on the overseas side of things, so that might have helped you out actually. But yeah, you're right. It's the raising when it came in 2006. It's just like a spider's web. It's just tangled itself with all pieces of legislation. It was incredibly complicated. As a pensions lawyer, I did find it one of the most complex areas I ever had to advise in. But of course, its tentacles go everywhere. And you're right. HMRC have done this, but then they realise that might have an impact over there. And there are still legislative changes that need to be made. So it's not 100% in yet. I think we know where those changes need to be made, but they're still not being made. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Just a final question, really, might be for Sarah. That makes things more complicated, more work. Is this all covered in the transition work we're doing to make it efficient and effective to be able to make those decisions, or is it adding to the workload?
As Gavin said, we've got a whole session with the pension officers later on to obviously delve into more detail. Members who come into this sort of arena, we invariably use our technical and regulations team to double check everything there. But I think, you've seen the figures that are in question here. As a scheme with over 155,000 members, there's only a very, very small percentage of people this affects. They do currently get a pension input statement. If they breach those allowances, there are mechanisms for them to use scheme pays facilities for tax on an ongoing basis, with a reduction accordingly with their pension benefits. But yes, there will be some, to the affected members, there will be some comms, I think, to put those comms much more widely, probably can cause further confusion to members where this is never going to impact on them. But absolutely, from the session today, we'll then be looking at what are all the other process changes. But everything we do nowadays, Councillor Carey, clearly we're looking to ensure the process is as effective and efficient as possible. But I think because of the complexity, there has to be some manual input and consideration, because that eyeballing is still really important.
Okay, I'll make a comment. It does appear that there's a lot of extra work that is needed to focus on very few members, so it's disproportionate in my view.
I'd agree with you. However, the consequences for those members can be quite severe.
Sure. Thank you. Any further comments, questions? Yes, Councillor Owen.
Yes, following on from that, do we know exactly how many members this will affect? I was very pleased to hear the presentation, because I think I might actually understand it now. My son is one of those consultants that you talked about, and our telephone conversations inevitably get on to our fights with the taxman. And one of the things he talks to me about is the lifetime allowance, which I've never understood. He put that down to me being stupid, but I think I understand it now that you've explained it. But my real question is, do we know how many people this affects? Because it is significant, because what my son was telling me, and as far as the NHS is concerned, the older consultants were leaving in droves because they were being stung for tax. And he's not quite as old as that, but he's fearful, or was fearful, of getting a big tax bill at the end of the year, simply because money was going into his pension pot, which everybody's encouraged to do anyway. So it was a nonsense.
Lee.
Thank you, Chair. Just to tag on to that very sensible comment, we're not necessarily going to know what other pension pots people have, so people could be impacted and we won't know about it.
Yeah, good point. Sarah.
Absolutely, we won't necessarily know. However, obviously, we do know about our own members, where their pot within the LGPS is either at that limit, approaching that limit. So, for example, on the annual benefit statement that goes out to active members, we always there is an entry there that tells them what percentage their current pot is at of the lifetime allowance, 50%, 99%, 105%. Whilst obviously as a fund, it is important that we communicate to our members. There is also a personal responsibility here for individuals to understand what steps they may wish to take. So, for example, we do have some members that have some existing lifetime protection certificates in place, but ultimately applying for that certificate is their responsibility. I think our response is to provide them with the communication so that they understand what they may need to do. But I think following on from today's presentation, we'd agreed that we would come back as a fund with a report to give more detail about the potential scale to members within the Nottinghamshire Pension Fund. So we'll be working on that, and it's within the work programme to bring that report back.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. I think that concludes that for the day. I can thank Gavin very much for the presentation. It did take a little bit longer than we expected, but I think there's some good questions there that needed answering. Okay, thank you very much. I think we need to move on to item number 5, which is our pooling update. Tamsin will welcome our guests in. Oh, we're not done, actually. We do need to take a vote on the last item. All those show members will note the report. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so item number 5 is our update from pooling from LGPS Central. Welcome this morning, Richard and the team. Really just want to, before I hand over to Tamsin and Richard, I'd like to move the recommendation, which is on page 43 of the agenda pack. Can I have a seconder, please? Thank you. Okay, so who are you leading it for?
I don't really have anything to say.
Okay, so over to you, Richard. You do when you speak and off when you finish, please. Thank you.
So the first thing, I guess, is to introduce myself. My name's Richard Law-Deeks. I've now been in place as CEO of LGPS Central for a month. I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. I'll just introduce my colleagues. I've got Cara Forrest, who's Head of Clients, Mark Davies, who's Head of Public Markets, and Belinda Moore, who's one of our non-executive directors. The next thing I want to say is just to thank you for entrusting us with your assets. It's a real honour that you entrust us to manage these assets, and also to thank Councillor Kerry for chairing the shareholders forum and also playing a role in my recruitment process. So I was just going to go through some of the highlights of the last month for me. So it's been really great to meet with the team. I've been doing this individually, joining team meetings, sitting out on the floor with the team, and it's been great. We also had an all hands meeting, which is a bit like a town hall, which got everyone together, and we talked about some of the challenges ahead and some of our successes. So I'm really excited about the talent we've got in the team and the talent we're attracting, and that's really great to see. I've also travelled and met 6 of our 8 partner funds. With meeting the other 2 is planned fairly soon. I've really valued doing this. I've really enjoyed seeing the Central region as well. It's actually the second time I've been in this room. The first time it was 30 degrees outside, and it's a little bit colder today. So that's a good segue into the next thing I've really found interesting about Central is responsible investment. So it's deeply part of and widely part of the company. I knew this as I was coming in, but I've really seen it demonstrated on the inside. I've been participating in board meetings, so those have continued as I've joined. It's been really interesting to see how important RI is within those board meetings and across the organisation. We've also held a strategy day 4 weeks in. That was quite interesting, but that's really helpful for me to get up to speed and understand the challenges that I need to make. Externally, we've had a general election, and yesterday we've had an interesting announcement about the National Wealth Fund. It will be interesting to see how the new government interacts with the LGPS and what they want, and I'm looking forward to engaging with government on that. I also think I want to get this in and mention the football last night. It's particularly important for me as my wife is Spanish, so this might be the last time you see me. I'm really keen to start making the changes we need to better serve our partner funds at Central. Some of this has started before I joined, and I'll do the people update shortly. We'll continue to build your confidence in our investment performance and develop products and solutions and work with you on the priorities ahead for the company. Some of the changes I want to make can be implemented quite quickly. The rest we'll need to talk to you as part of the business strategy and budget process, which is coming up shortly. Belinda, is there anything you want to add?
No, really, just to echo Richard's sentiments. I think we're quite excited at LGPS Central now about the rebooting, really, with arrival of Richard, with the new executive team that we're building. I've been involved with the company for just a year now, so still relatively new to the sector. My background is very much in stakeholder management, in communications, in PR, so looking forward to working with you and with the company on how we can really embed that into how we work with our partners. So it's good to be here today. Thank you.
And just for clarity, Belinda is one of our non-exec directors, so independent non-executive directors.
I'll just pause for any questions there, and if not, I'll move on to the people update. Yeah. So we've had a new Chief People Officer, Anushka Ramsey. She started in March. She couldn't be here today, so I'll try and pick up this section. She's had a really, really positive impact in that time. Slide 8 is our values. I'm not going to read these out, but I'm really pleased to see these are being lived, and we're holding each other to account. If you ever visit our offices, they're all over the wall, and they're on our computer screens. So a couple of times people in the team have kind of recited them back to me, which is really great. Slide 9 is the pillars of our people plan. So this is now being implemented, but in a very much in an agile way, acknowledging that I'm coming to the business, I might want to do things in a certain way. It's prioritising what needs to be done to deliver change. And again, it's very exciting that Central is it's a small organisation. And just in the 4 weeks that I've been there, I've seen a real impact on the culture. And for me, that's the most exciting thing about joining an organisation that's relatively young and very malleable. The team has been really, really responsive to new leadership. It feels like there's a different tone and energy in the team, and I've had this fed back already, which is again really positive. It kind of reminds me of that old adage that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And I think if we can get the culture right, It will be the strategy for our partner funds will come out of that. Again, that's all I was going to say on the people strategy. If there's any questions, yeah.
Thank you. So thank you again, Richard, for that introduction. So obviously what we do is manage your assets on behalf of you. And we've come a long way since we started back in I think the company was established in 2016, but the first launch officially in 2018. So what I've got here on slide 11 is just a little bit of a diagram to show just that journey so far. And all the ones in green you can see are the funds in which Nottinghamshire have invested in. So it's just, we've come a long way since then, and we've got a long way to go to get everything pulled. But the point of it is we're here to work with you as best we can to implement your investment strategy. So looking to the future, what have we got on this year? On the next slide, I've just got a couple of bits for you there which show the kind of things we're working on. The Buy and Maintain Credit Fund, private credit and infrastructure. Now, obviously, not all of these are necessarily what Nottinghamshire need, but the whole point is it's about pooling. We've got 7 other partner funds that we work closely with, and we design funds and strategies, and they're constantly evolving to meet your needs. So that's a little bit about where we've been and where we're going. But what we actually do day to day, I'll let Mark talk to you about that because he's the expert in all of this.
Thank you very much, Carl. Hello, everyone. Good to see you again. We tend to come to you to talk through the investment performance, or myself and my team, but we don't actually really ever present to you about how we kind of do it and what we do on the day to day. So I thought we'd put in this slide 13, where it kind of shows what we do day to day in kind of like the actively run funds. So the team have daily scrutiny and can see all the positions daily and have oversight for all the funds and the managers. So that's, they look at each individual manager. They have meetings with them, they look at their performance, they look at their transactions, positions they're buying, reasons why they're buying those companies, whether they align to their philosophy or their process, or what they believe will beat the stock market or the index, anyway, the benchmark. They then have to merge or blend these managers together at the fund level. So this is kind of when we talk about the emerging market fund or the global equity fund or the investment grade corporate bond fund. Below that fund level on the managers, so the team do scrutiny of the managers, then they also have to put those managers together for the fund, because that's what generates the returns for your investments in the actively run funds. Obviously, sometimes there can be issues can arise, and that can trigger intervention. So where Central might fall out, sorry, more phrase, probably lose confidence with a manager. I was going to say fall out of love, but that's the wrong phrase. So lose confidence in a manager. So this could be because a team departs, and we've had examples and experience of that, or performance. Performance isn't in line with how you would expect that fund manager to be performing at that time, and so we can really dig down and that would trigger a kind of like more focused intervention. So we would have deeper dive meetings with the manager to really get to understand if it is really broken or whether it's recovered and it can be explained away. The process as we've evolved, we are relatively still a young business, only 6 years old, and these funds are still quite young in life. So there's all funds undertake a 3-year annual review, where again we go revisit, sit with the clients and the partner funds to assess whether they are still fit for purpose for them, what decisions were taken in some of the funds 5, 6, 7 years ago. Are they still relevant? Are they still delivering what the partner funds want? But a common thread through all that, and without flicking slides and reading them too much, is the approach to RI response investing. I think you will be hearing much more from my colleagues on this space later today. As Richard said, it's an area of focus. It's supported by all our partner funds, and this just gives you a bit of a walkthrough of how we interact as an investment team with our RI team. So when we're looking at manager selections, and even when it's a written question to a manager, there are questions around how they integrate RI and if it aligns with our policies and approaches. They're then involved in the manager selection. So when we meet and research those managers in depth, we're joined by members of their team so they can really drive into the managers and assess them. They also join us on that monitoring process. So again, every quarterly meeting, the RI team are with the investment team, A, to challenge the managers, and B, to improve the internal resource as well. So the investment teams are also learning from the internal RO team as well to know what to challenge so that the business becomes scalable, and it's developing our own staff in this space as well. RO isn't it all just about how you kind of like assess a company's risk factors and what products and services they provide. There's also the element of stewardship and engagement and voting. And again, you'll hear much more about that from the team later this afternoon, but it's safe to say that we undertake all the voting for all the funds and all the investments that we have within Central. We have a stewardship plan that's agreed with all the partner funds, focusing on key themes. And then there is a question at the moment that's constantly raised is, does engagement work? Well, we have an escalation strategy, so it's not just talking to the managers, talking to the companies. There's actually processes in place that could lead to potential exclusion. Now, we've never got to that stage, but there is a five-tier programme that you'll be able to hear much more about this afternoon.
I just ask, so how do you assess your effectiveness in that responsible investment stewardship? How do you know you are doing a good job?
Good question. I guess it's really seeing company behaviour change. It's a long-term process. Companies don't change their behaviours overnight. You can see, if it's certain companies where you're looking for climate plans in place or as disclosures, and you work together in a collective platform, you can see improvements in company behaviour and company releases or disclosures, I should say. So a lot of it is kind of like some of the less tangible elements. I can't sit here and say, well, we see their share price go up by 10% because is it because they put out a climate risk policy, or is it because they had a great earnings quarter? So I don't think you can directly link them, but you can see companies' behaviour, and if you look historically, those companies that behave responsibly do outperform.
Could I just add, we do, we log and track all our engagements, but also we had an RI summit recently, which I had the pleasure of opening, and BP were actually there, talking to us. So I think it's part of it is also about how we're treated in the market and how serious they are, which I think is good.
Is there any questions? Any further questions I can take? If not, I'll hand over to Carl.
Yes, that's a little bit about the products that we've got so far and how we work and how we monitor our managers and the underlying strategies. But looking forward, pooling is here to stay. And for us, it's about making sure we work closely with yourselves and people like William Vaughan here, to better understand what your exact investment needs are, what your strategy is going to be, so that we can then help you implement it. So we've got a little bit of a way to go with Nottinghamshire to get more assets under management, but we're working closely and working hard to make sure that does happen in a way that suits you. It's about continually working, having that continuous dialogue and getting opportunities like this to come and meet you all. So thank you very much.
Yeah, I've got a number of questions. First three are kind of high-level questions and really asked to Richard and Belinda, I think. And the first one is that all the pools have had to find a balance between delivering exactly what their partners want, and which is obviously more funds but less efficient and more costly, and having fewer funds, which may not deliver exactly what the funds want, but is a more efficient way of doing it. So the first question is, just comment on how you see that balance going forward. Should I give 3 questions? Or the second question is really about resources. How do you think you have the right resources to deliver good performance? Because ultimately, performance is what we are all after. Bearing in mind, of course, that there is a cost attached to more resources. And the third question is really more about governance. And how can all the partner funds, but particularly this fund, because we're here in Nottingham, can help you, because it is our responsibility as much as yours, to get this right? So 3 questions there.
Thank you, William. So I think that it needs to be driven by our partner funds. We need to deliver what our partner funds want us to deliver. So I think less pools. We need our partner funds to come together and have that discussion amongst themselves and tell us they're happy for us to go down that road. In terms of resources, I think you talking about our geographical location in Wolverhampton and being able to recruit talent. So I think that it's very interesting. Some of the newer people joining the organisation since I've been there have got very impressive CVs, and I think that's around market dynamics and the fact that we are an institutional investor, and people want to come and manage money for an organisation like Central, and these are people who have who have worked in the city, and it's really exciting that they're now coming to us. What was the third? Remind me what the third question was. Sorry.
What are the things the funds can do to help this succeed? That you'll want to succeed.
I think just continue to have that dialogue that Cara talked about. Continue to engage with us, talk with each other as well. Let's try and find the places where we can. It's I think you alluded to it in your first point. Not everyone's going to be happy with some products, but if we can all find compromises, we can all benefit from bigger scale and bigger pools.
Sorry, can I? Oh, yes. I think you also mentioned governance, William, in your. Yeah. Yeah, and I think, obviously sitting on the board as an independent non-exec director, I think the governance that I see, because I sit on several different boards, and the governance I see at LGPS Central is very robust. I think we have a huge amount of expertise on that board, both from my fellow non-execs, but also from the executives who attend those board meetings. And I think we have, and we're working hard to have increasing dialogue with our partners to ensure, they really understand what we're trying to achieve, and we're doing what you want us to achieve, and we can ensure there's good governance around that. So I think as an independent non-exec, I'm confident in that, and that obviously is very important to me.
Any more questions, comments? Yes, William.
May I ask one very small detail question, which is I happen to see your business assumptions for a couple of new funds, the real assets and direct lending, which you are thinking of launching. And there was a macro assumption behind it, which I happen to disagree with quite strongly. And my question really is not that am I right or you wrong, but what process of challenge do you have to test your internal macro assumptions?
I guess that one's for me. I think you're referring to a private markets product. Yeah, okay. So I can talk about the process. So we have an investment committee, and it's that governance element. So, and there's also a private markets investment committee, a subset of that. So the investment case or the business case for a product goes through, it's written and designed by the team in conjunction with the partner funds and the demands there. It then goes to the investment committee for challenge and debate to see if those assumptions are correct or we agree with the justification for them. It then goes via the operational risk and compliance and audit committee to rubber stamp that again the business is able to deliver that product. Then it comes to partner funds. I think that must be where it's landed at the moment, is it? It should comes across and then it's challenged there. And at each stage of these, it needs approvals to progress. Once it's had kind of partner fund approval, then it would go on to the board and the exco, and then the board for approval. So there's multiple layers of challenge. Your challenge is taken on board, and I believe the team have responded. But I don't believe it's actually been approved yet, so it can be taken on board and discussed.
Yeah, and just to add to that, that's exactly the kind of challenge and conversation we want to be having with you all, and why it's really important for us that we get our products right, but that we've got that external challenge from you and your expertise, so that we can continue to deliver. And it's something that we're looking at going forward when we talk about communication and collaboration. These are the exact areas that we want to work on, so that you can get your views across and we can hear it, and you can understand why products are built in a certain way. So that compromise thing might not be such a compromise if we all understand where we're coming from. Yeah.
I turned off. And just to add further to that, and something I've noticed is we've introduced an investment oversight committee. So this is made up of Ned's and the investment team at Central, and it's going to work through challenging all of those assumptions as well. Another level of challenge. We've recently gone through investment beliefs, and I think kind of macro beliefs will also feature in that going forwards.
Okay. I see no further indications. Can I just thank you very much for coming on and getting that cultural change over to us, because I think it's clear from us here that things are moving forward. So I'm quite excited by that, and I'll see you in a little while for lunch, maybe. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
You can stay if you like. Okay, we had a recommendation. We moved second. All those in favour of the noting, please. Thank you. Lovely. Let's move on to item number 6, which is the Department of Levelling Up Housing and Communities letter. So before I hand over to Tamsin, the recommendation, page 71, I'll move it. Have a seconder, please.
I'll second it, Chair.
Thank you. Okay, Tamsin, would you like to introduce the report, please?
Thank you, Chair. On the 15th of May, earlier this year, Simon Hoare, the then Minister for Local Government, sent a letter to Section 151 officers of administering authorities in England, asking a number of questions relating to pooling of investments, governance, and possible efficiency savings arising from creating larger pensions authorities. This letter is attached at Appendix A to the report, and a proposed response from the Section 151 officer is attached as Appendix B. This response will be returned to MHCLG, as the department has changed its name, to make known the Fund's view on various issues raised by the letter, which should be informative for new ministers in the department. The response outlines the Fund's progress on pooling investments and identifies the challenges to pooling further at the current time. Governance of the pool and the pension fund are considered effective, with particular recognition of the stability and commitment of members of this committee, which is key. In response to the query about efficiency, the letter mentions the low cost per member of running the Nottinghamshire Pension Fund and the continual improvements sought through efficiency measures and digitisation. A number of the complexities and risks of merging funds are itemised in the response, and this is not believed to be an effective way of improving efficiency for our fund. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Tamsin. Yes, the recipients will be different, recognise that. Any questions or comments from members, please? I don't see anything, so recommendation was moved seconded. All those in favour, please? Thank you, that's unanimous. Okay. Item number 7 is the Local Authority Pension Fund Forum report. Before I hand over to Kieran, page 80, recommendation I'll move.
I'll second.
Thank you. Kieran.
Thank you, Chair. The Local Authority Pension Fund Forum was formed in 1990 to provide an opportunity for the UK's local authority pension fund to discuss investment and shareholder engagement issues. It exists to assist administering authorities discharge the statutory responsibilities and promote the long-term investment interests of UK local authority pension funds. A hybrid meeting was held at Smith Square in April, LGA headquarters, which I attended online as an officer representative. The meeting included a discussion, amongst other things, a discussion on steel recycling as LATFA forming a policy on the least disruptive strategy for the industry to pursue as it transitions to decarbonised production methods. There were also presented updates on LATF's company engagement work up to the end of March 2024. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Kieran, any questions, comments from members? I just have one comment. It is possible for any member that wishes to go to one of these meetings or be involved, if it's online. It is a very interesting meeting, and it covers members of the forum from all over the country, and you get lots of differing views. So it is quite interesting. Okay, but the recommendation is moved and seconded. All those in favour, please. Thank you. Unanimous. Moving on to item number 8, which is proxy voting, which is again Kieran. Our recommendations on page 85. I'll move them. Second, please. Thank you very much, Kieran.
Thank you again, Chair. The fund has responsibility for voting any directly held shares. Voting is undertaken on the fund's behalf by Hermes EOS, in line with the voting principles of LGPS Central. LGPS Central also engages with the companies it has holdings in. This is reported in its quarterly stewardship update. And the most recent update highlights, among other things, various initiatives to improve corporate governance in Asia. An overview of the Hermes voting activity and Central's engagement work is shown in the report and also published on our fund's website on a quarterly basis. Okay. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Kieran. Any comments, questions from members, please? Again, I see none. When we vote on the recommendation, all those in favour, please. Thank you very much. Moving on to item number 9, which is the work programme. The recommendation I'll formally move on page 87. Thank you. Tamsin, do you want to take us through the report, please?
Thank you, Chair. In the appendix, you can see the work programme for the rest of the committee meetings of the current and the next cycle. Well, the next cycle. Members may notice that Aberdeen are presenting their quarterly performance to the November committee rather than the September committee. The November committee will be followed by a working party meeting where elements of the property portfolio will be discussed with Aberdeen, and I'll be circulating invitations to this meeting in the near future. Their slots in September, I've now had confirmation that LGIM are able to attend that instead of December. And the committee is asked to identify any additional reports required. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Tamsin. Can I ask if all members are happy with the work plan? Any other comments, additions? Again, I see none. It was a very comprehensive report, Tamsin. Thank you. So we've moved the recommendation. All those in favour, please, to accept the work programme. Thank you. That's unanimous. And I think that brings us to the end of the meeting. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending and your contributions. Oh, sorry. Are we still being broadcast?